Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for Animated Soundscapes, Creating Space Through Sound, presented by the Directors Guild of Canada in Ontario at the 2022 Members Lounge. My name is Rhiannon Seath, and I'm the Senior Coordinator of Programming and Membership here at the Academy. Members Lounge 2022 is presented by the Canadian Media Producers Association, which represents hundreds of Canada's independent producers. They are the people who make the shows and movies you love. Members Lounge 2022 is also made possible with the support of our programming partners, Directors Guild of Canada in Ontario, William F. White International, Bell Fund, Le Fond Bell, Boat Rocker, NABET 700M Unifor, Telefilm Canada, La Banque Nationale, le Bureau du Cinéma et de la Télévision du Québec, the Independent Production Fund, Panavision, and La SODEC. Just before we get started, a reminder that if you have any questions for today's speakers, please put them in the Q&A and we'll save some time for those at the end of the session. With no further ado, I'd like to introduce our panel. First, we have Amin Batiya. Amin is an Emmy-nominated composer whose TV scores include Anne with an E, The Handmaid's Tale, and Let's Go Luna, many of them co-written with friend and colleague Ari Posner, with whom he shares several Canadian Screen Awards. Next, we have J.R. Fountain. JR is a supervising sound editor, sound designer, and re-recording mixer working in film and dramatic TV. In the world of animation, JR has been fortunate to work on a number of feature films, including Paw Patrol the movie, The Breadwinner, and Ratchet and Clank. Up next is Christy Mcintyre. Christy is a sound editor and designer who's been working in film and TV since 2013. She's worked on shows ranging from horror to children's animation, with credits on Overlord and The Underwoods, Wildhood, and Run the Burbs. And finally, Rachel Sim, who is a sound designer currently working as the producer at A Shell in the Pit Audio, a culturally and gender diverse audio studio that specializes in music, sound effects, and audio programming for video games and interactive experiences. Some of her credits include Jet the Far Shore, Sneaky Sasquatch, and Parkitect. And now I will pass it off to our moderator for today's session, Katie Jensen. Katie has been making podcasts for the last 12 years, which makes her a real vet in the industry. As a classically trained musician and journalist, she loves to combine music and sound effects in unexpected ways to surprise and delight audiences. She's the principal of Vocal Fry Studios, a Toronto-based podcast company, and has developed shows for CBC Podcasts, DGC Ontario, the Polaris Prize, and the Canada Media Fund. All right, take it away, Katie.
Thank you so much. Also, I should mention that I've been having, as a great, an audio person, this is my worst nightmare, but my interface has decided to act up all day. So normally I'd be using a microphone right now, but during the trailers, it started to cut out. So I thought, in case anyone can't hear me or my audio starts acting a little bit weird, just let me know. I want to start out just by getting a sense of what people do, because we have such a diverse panel today that it makes sense to get, in everyone's own words, a little bit about how they would describe their job. So I wanted to start with Amin. Can you, in 2 minutes or less, just describe what it is that you do for a living?
I make noise for a living, and whether it's music or whether it's sound design, it's more on the music side of things. My albums are combinations of orchestral music and sound design, and then my music is usually for TV and film. And in that job, I love working with other sound designers. And because I've done some of that myself, I understand and respect what they do.
Wonderful. Kristi, what do you do for a living?
I'm a sound effects editor and designer for live action, animation, film, TV, a little bit of everything. I cut dialogue as well. So I work with actors in ADR, production sound, all kinds of that stuff as well.
And JR?
Yeah, I'm a sound designer and a mixer. So I take care of sound effects in films and TV, and on some projects as well, I'll do the mixing, which is generally on the sound effects side of things as well. So we're just balancing all the levels to make sure that everybody's hearing what they need to hear.
And last but not least, Rachel.
As a producer at the studio I'm at, I get to work with a bunch of sound designers and audio programmers, and my job is mostly to make sure that all the different sound design needs and also the audio programming, implementation into middleware and hardware, game engines is all done on time, and mostly just to make sure that everybody's not feeling too burnt out, that everyone feels like the workload's appropriate, but still getting everything done on time for our clients.
JR, can you tell us what sound design encompasses in all of our worlds?
Yeah, sure. For me, sound design is really like the catch-all term for what we do. I kind of break it down into three pieces in terms of recording and editing and mixing. And so sound design really is like collecting sounds and putting them to picture, and really just trying to tell the story, I guess. It's not just sound effects as well, I should say. I think sound design can be used by a director like in all three disciplines, whether it's dialogue, music, or sound effects. But really, we're there, you know, to help tell this story through the speakers and into people's ears. Yeah, that's, you know, that's our job. I think, you know, for me, that's kind of where sound design's at.
I'm wondering, Kristi, can you tell me what you feel like the world of sound can do for storytelling as a medium that visual can't, or that visual is limited in? Like what is offered by just really diving deep into using all of these elements to tell a story through sound?
Right, yeah, sound has a lot to offer. There's so much that can be told off of the screen, right? And it makes the world a little bit more lived in, like something that visuals can't do. Different moods, a lot of subconscious storytelling is done through sound design.
That's great. And I'm curious, I want to pivot now to like the literal process of how we all work. So just Amin, your background is stuffed. Like I look at your background and it just looks like an absolute playground. Can you tell us just the literal, what is going on in the background behind you? Are these tools that you use every single day?
These are these are tools. You're very kind, first of all, but I'm old. So when you get as old as me, your resume will be as stuffed as well. I've been fortunate to do a lot of various things. I started in synthesizers. I began in electronics. I was actually studying broadcasting. I never expected to be doing music for a living. And then through a synthesizer tape contest by Roland, that kind of opened the doors to everything. So some of this stuff I still use because, you know, it's tactile. You're creating sounds, you're designing things. I do have the workstation stuff with all the monitors and them, you know, and all the latest controller things and stuff. But for really, you know, getting in there and playing with plasticine, it's still nice to be able to work with, you know, with the hardware synthesizers and all the Eurorack stuff. Like in the last few years, that's all come back. And I think it's because new generations actually just want to hold knobs and make sound as opposed to pull down menus or plug in menus on a screen. But for film and television, it has to be on the computer because our deadlines are so fast. So you know, each day depends on what it is I'm doing. On album projects, I get to play with this stuff a little bit more because you have more time for it. But for television and film and deadlines, you know, it's passion and precision. You have to come up with creative stuff, be it music, be it sound, be it, you know, how you make the dialogue work. But you have to be precise about it. You have to know how to run your tools because, you know, there's still a deadline and there's no room for error.
What would you say is like the piece of gear that you rely on the most, or is like your fallback? Let's say you've been given an assignment that has like, you know, quick turnaround time and you need to compose something quickly. What is it that you're going to rely on to just turn out something really quick?
You know, I wish I could search for some creative answer to tell you, but like probably everybody else on this panel, it is my Macintosh computer. I've got the cylindrical one. I think we call it the trash can.
The trash can, yeah.
The nicer one I've heard is the Dyson, because it looks like a Dyson vacuum cleaner. So it's a Dyson Mac. It's a 12 core. It is complaining bitterly. Not unlike Rachel's cat that we hear occasionally. The fans are getting old. Every now and then there's squeaking noises from the motor, and I'm just holding on to dear life for all the new, you know, there's the new Mac M1 Ultra coming along, and in a few months, I'm hoping to have that. I mean, the good news and bad news is that is the centerpiece of everything that I have to do, and I have a backup of it. You know, I have a second computer ready to go, just like your audio interface. If something goes wrong, the client can't see the difference. You just switch over and multiple backup systems stuff. So yeah, that's the number one thing.
we'll get back to your workspace and your workflow in a second, but I want to ask JR, you have some, you've got, I see, a MIDI keyboard behind you. You've got a lot
Yeah.
of boxes, some monitors. What are your tools that you've got in your studio space?
Yeah, so yeah, like what you can see in the picture there is like I've got my computer, it's on the other side of this wall. And it's stuffed with all of my software and plugins or whatever. And then I have the MIDI controller there, which I use as a sampler basically with a program called SoundMiner. And so I can play my sound effects on the keyboard basically. It's a really kind of intuitive way to work with sound, and it's nice to kind of get my face off of the screens, kind of like what Amin was saying. I really appreciate kind of getting away from the computer if I can, in a sense, and just be able to kind of play over there on that. And then I've also got like my control surface there, which is the faders you can see in the back. So that once I've got, tracks laid down, it just gives me a little bit more like tactile feel in terms of riding levels and moving things around the room in terms of panning and that sort of thing. So I just find each of them all kind of offer their own, their own little ways of getting, some creativity out and doing it efficiently, but in a way that's enjoyable as well.
Excellent. And Kristi, I see you have some baffling behind you.
I do, yes, yeah. Anything to help reduce the traffic noise that I have to deal with on a daily basis, the lawnmowers and all that. Yeah, it helps to cut down on the reflections, and I built them myself because, save a couple bucks, have some fun out in the garage with the power tools.
Definitely. Is it that you mix really loudly as well when you're at home, or are you at the office right now?
No, this is actually my home. I've been pretty remote this past 2 years, I guess it is now. Not a lot of studio visits, but yeah, it helps keep my sound from disturbing my neighbors and kills the reflective surfaces. So yeah, anything to keep the sound a little more contained with me.
And Rachel, I see nothing behind you, which could mean anything. It could mean that you don't work in this room or that you're doing everything on the computer.
So these days I don't actually do much sound design anymore. I used to do a lot more, but my role as a producer, now that we're such a big team and we're always juggling so many projects, means I don't get to do as much of the fun stuff. I mean, my job is still fun, but not as much of like the audio fun things. So I work out of this room, but it's mostly a lot of game capturing, testing, auditing, and the sort of back end nitty gritty stuff that I then pass on to our designers who get to do the fun work.
I want to talk about how you approach a project, and this could be anything specific to something you're working on right now or something in the past, but maybe we can start with Amin and just tell me what's the first step when you are given a project in terms of establishing the perspective. And is it that you start off just by reading a brief or having a conversation with someone? Do you dive deep into research? What do you do as a first step in terms of starting a project?
I think the first step is conversation, and whether it's a brief, I actually prefer talking directly to the showrunner, the creator of whatever it is we're working on. That's the best place. That person is the vision. And what all of us do, we're accompanists, whether it's dialogue, whether it's music or sound effects, we serve the vision of what that filmmaker has in mind. So learning from there what it is that is needed. Also, where, for me particularly working in music, where music can enhance something and where music should stay out of the way. Decades ago, music was needed because sound was not very sophisticated. So just a gigantic orchestra could fill in all the emotion. And even on animated shows now, there's still a leaning towards the music to kind of really go big, to kind of fill in all the things that don't exist in a natural environment, because in many animation stuff, there is no environment at all. But when done right, dialogue, sound effects, and music can each, choreograph themselves really well. I worked on a big feature film, which I hated because there was no communication allowed between any of the departments. And then some of the smallest projects I've worked on have been such joy because we all talked to each other. We knew what dialogue was being changed. The sound designer and myself would have conversations. Okay, you'll cover this area, I'll cover this area, not only in the show, but also in the ranges. So if, it's a show about an earthquake, then me doing low rumbling stuff with all of my fancy toys, it's just going to make a mess. So why don't I do something that is a strange kind of pattern that's up high so that it can work with what the sound is doing?
I'm really curious about how you approach revision rounds with the projects that you're working on, because with dialogue, let's say a line gets cut really late in the game, it really affects your timing. So are there hard stops that you have where you say, this is like, you know, we're on revision round like 29 here. It can't change anymore. Or do you approach the sound writing, the soundscape writing from a perspective of it can be looped and shortened if need be?
Revisions are very tough, and I now have a wonderful therapist that helps me with those. We are moving a lot faster. Things are changing a lot faster, and I find that if the entire team is really literally in sync at the beginning, and we all know what each department is doing, we even know what problems are coming. Like if I know a scene is a temporary thing, or I know that the editor's not happy with it yet, that I know and I can work with, and that's great. The best revisions come when it's creative, when the showrunner comes out and says, I like that, but that's not what I imagined. How about going here? And collaboratively working with another artist is the most enjoyable. I find the ones where you have 17 people in different parts of the world and they all have to coordinate and feed you notes. And some of them are from the buyers and some of them are from the distributors. And there's all this mishmash organization. That gets to be very, very tough. And the good news is with the computers, we can fix this a lot more. Like in the old days of 24-track tape, you know, you can't make the show any shorter. You can't shorten 24-track tape. And then as soon as you went into computers, you actually can time stretch, which is a good and bad thing. So I always say, let's solve all the problems before we get there. And then let's save those, you know, revision 29 things for when something truly is something unexpected.
I have many thoughts about revisions, but I'm sure and I'm just so excited to talk to all of you that I probably overwrote how many questions I want to ask. But JR, can you tell us about what it looks like when you start a project? Is it similar to Amin's process where you start with a meeting and then you just go?
It kind of depends on the project. I think most of mine, I either get given a script or a cut of the movie or to watch or read. And then discussions kind of come after that. It depends on the people and how you like to work. It depends on whether you've worked with them before or not. I've been fortunate the last couple of years to be on some projects where it's the second project that I've worked with the director or the showrunner. And so there's less communication that's required, and it's more about just kind of getting up to speed. Okay, well, what's new in this season? What are the things that I need to look out for? Or, you know, what's the, like, how do you envision this film to sound? You know, like for Paw Patrol, one of the things that was a very big concern early on and throughout the entire process was that we have a very large action movie that we're making for 5-year-olds, and we don't want to scare the snot out of them in the theater. And so that was a big concern for everybody. And so for us to be able to kind of address that and have that in the back of our minds constantly while we're working, you know, is obviously really important. So yeah, I think, you know, like I said, it's usually a cut of the film or a script, and then from there it just kind of depends on what the show is, whether I need to do some research, do I need to find some sounds to record, do I need to have a conversation with the director because there's some things that are unclear to me about it. You know, it kind of depends.
Does anyone on the panel use any kind of like vision boarding, but for sound, to say like, here's my palette of which I'm drawing from? Or is that just me? All right, just me.
No, I think we all have different ways.
Yeah.
Go ahead, JR, you first.
I've tried this a couple of times on projects where like I've had a whiteboard out, and it's more about like trying to hit emotions in the film. And then thinking about, okay, well, what kind of sounds might evoke these types of emotions at these certain points in the script or like in the show. You know, and I find it's a helpful tool, I think, just to kind of get the gears going. But I feel like the few times that I've tried it, I abandon it rather quickly. So.
For composers, the vision board is usually the template. In this day and age, you have so many sounds inside your computer. The challenge is actually just deciding what not to use and really paring it down to finding, you know, among our hundreds of sounds and plugins and things, you know, the types of instruments that speak really well to what you've learned from what the story needs and what your showrunner needs. And then musically, you come up with little motifs and you come up with a melody and you realize, oh, that's going to work well for this part of the film, or this is going to work well. And we save those as little nuggets, either as tiny little MIDI files, or yeah, I'll sometimes have Post-it notes just all over the computer. I have like 4 monitors, computers, but you know what? A Post-it note, it's never going to crash. It's never going to accidentally get deleted by a software revision. So I still use Post-it notes, and as little reminders to myself of what parts of the show to concentrate on and remember this. I mean, before we started, JR has a whole bunch of things behind there, little motivational Post-it notes. He's
Yeah,
got
I
back
show blow
there,
the screen up so I can see, I
Yeah,
can spy
yeah.
on you.
I've got one
There you
back there. It
go.
just says work hard and be nice. And that's, I
A
think,
good one.
for all of us, that's, it's a teamwork thing, right?
Mine says hero's journey cut short by unimportant email. So
Oh, yes. Oh,
me.
yes.
Big time.
massive. Kristi, what is the method behind your madness? How do you approach a brief?
Well, typically on a lot of the series work that I do, we'll have a spotting session between all the clients and the creatives for the first few episodes. And then we usually get into a pretty good rhythm and flow, and we build up a lot of our palette in the first few episodes, and then we can kind of pull from them as the show goes on. So I'll typically, each episode, I'll go through the show, I'll mark it up for my sound design notes, and then I'll figure out what I can pull from past episodes, what I need to build, maybe what I can record, depending on what our schedules are like. Typically, we'll have 2 weeks per episode, at least for the series work that I've done, which is nice. So usually we get a good amount of time to record unique stuff for each episode. Yeah.
Question to sound designers, because on the music side, we've been told sometimes, don't worry about spotting, just write some music. We'll tell you if we like it or not. And I think that's so dangerous. Like, you have to spot, you have to sit down with the creators and have a game plan. All this stuff is fast, but it doesn't mean we can just, read your mind as to what's needed to be done. Is that happening in sound design as well? Are you sometimes told just run wild, and you think that's exciting, and then later you realize it's not?
Yeah, it can be catastrophic.
Yeah. So we have to have spotting.
I might push back a little bit. I kind of like kind of going at a show sometimes before getting to, and again, I think there's some context here. Like, if you've worked with somebody before, then I the one thing that I don't like about spotting sessions is that I feel like we talk a lot and we pitch ideas that ultimately don't work. And certainly maybe I just have bad ideas at spotting sessions. I don't know, but I find I have a hard time coming up with all that stuff right on the, right in the moment kind of thing. And so I find that while they are helpful for sure in getting some direction in places, I find it's like I'm just trying to get that first pass as fast as I can out to the director or the showrunners so that they can listen, and then they have something concrete to actually have some feedback for. Because I just find it depends again who you're working with, but the language for for our creatives that are leading the charge, it's not always there. And so when they've got something concrete to listen to, then it's like, oh, okay, well, that's a little bit closer to what you want, or that's way not what you want. And then anyway, so I don't mean to, like, I'm not trying to throw spotting sessions out, but just to offer another sort of perspective to it as well.
Love it. I love it that you're actually engaging, because sometimes panels can be like, and you, and you, and you, and you, but I love that you're just jumping in. And I would say, yes, let's keep doing that for the remainder of our very short time together. Just before I have some other kind of spicy questions to ask you, I would just want to ask Rachel, what is the method behind when you start a new project? And then we'll get into collaboration a little bit later on as well. But what's the method to your madness?
It sounds like it's very different from working linearly, which I've never done professionally. So usually it starts with a client meeting. We love to know if there's any audio references that the game developers are trying to go for their game, whether it's film or other games. And then hopefully we're handed a working build of the game. It might just be a vertical slice of one component. It could be, a longer segment of the game that's ready, and we go in and we play, and then we do what I guess is like a really, really big spotting session. All our designers get hands in to play the game to become familiar with it, but there's usually just one person, often me, who goes and writes down every single asset that needs to be created for the world. Beds, ambience beds, spot emitters, sound effects, Foley, all the different surface types, all the different impacts, anything like UI sounds, anything that has user interaction that needs a sound to let people know like, hey, I did something and that actually worked. Because it's a lot more technical. So if we don't have a list of all the sounds that are needed in the game, we won't know all of the things that need to be hooked up. And then we can't talk about what are the technical systems that are needed. Do we need to create some sort of occlusion system? Do we need a VO system for overlapping lines of dialogue in the game? How should all of that be handled? And are we working with middleware? What can we do with Fmod or Wise? And then what do we need to program or script directly in a game engine like Unity or Unreal? So for us, it's definitely a lot of planning before we even get started on any design work.
I'm really curious with different character motions and actions. I assume that different playables will have different speeds at which they, the weight of the character, for example. And in terms of character action, are you changing the time delay in which like a sound effect will happen when a character does a thing based on what character that is, based on how heavy the weight of the character is in the game?
Yeah, so those are all dynamic systems that we can build. So we can have things where like we can identify, we can have different series of footsteps, for example, for like different weight classes. Sometimes we'll have discrete footsteps for each character, but if we're sharing characters, we'll be like, first we have to know, is it like size 01, 02, or 03? And then if it's 02, it'll play the middle weight or something, and then it'll detect what surface it is. So it'll layer in an appropriate surface layer if we haven't baked those into like a single asset. So it'll be like, okay, so it's a heavy character on grass versus a light character on stone or something. Yeah, and so those are all things that we like to know in advance that we can plan for, because it's good to work out all of the more systemic things before we really get into a lot of the design and then realize, oh, we should have implemented these in a different way, and it would have required a system that we should have built earlier in the process.
How do you keep all of that organized?
That is an excellent question. For a very long time, it was a lot of spreadsheets. We recently moved into a project management tool called ClickUp. That's what we're using right now. But like,
yeah,
Jira,
I've heard of it.
Yeah, Jira is really common across a lot of developers. There's also like Hack and Plan that a lot of game devs like. It really depends. It's usually a combination of things. So we'll have a lot of documentation to track not just like design aesthetic, but also like these are all the technical systems, what order we should approach them in, and then whether or not it's something that we can handle on our own with our own programmers, or if it's something that we need to work with the game developers, because we might need some custom scripting that only they can do, especially if they're using like a custom game engine.
How long are ambient tracks typically in video games?
That varies depending on who you ask. So we like to keep our beds pretty sterile and pretty short, so 45 seconds to a minute loops. But what we like to do to make the environments come alive is to put a lot of scatter sounds and spot emitters in the world. So the emitters are things that are attached to objects in the world that would emit a sound, like you would expect, for example, a hum coming out of a refrigerator. But then we'll have what we call scatter sounds that we can trigger randomly, spatially in the world, at random intervals, at random volumes. So like birds or other creatures and stuff. So it'll sound like they're coming from anywhere in the 3D world that you're looking at.
Amazing. I want to ask all of you how often you get the chance to invent a sound for a place that doesn't exist on Earth. And maybe Amin, you might experience this a little bit more often because you're evoking things. But I like to think of, for example, in A Quiet Place, the sound effect of the aliens' ears opening up, what they used was a head of celery, like a stalks of celery, and they were twisting them violently because there's obviously no aliens on Earth that we know of yet. How do you kind of envision things that don't exist? Is it a process of just spending a lot of time imagining quietly by yourself? Anyone can take this one.
Yeah, coming up with sounds, I think it's tricky for sure. I don't know that I've had to create too many like other worlds per se, but certainly things that don't exist in our world. And so I think the one thing that's always helpful is that you're all like, I like to always go for real sounds, because, and by real sounds, I just mean as opposed to like a synthesized sound. Because we're always trying to find something that's familiar, like whether we end up doing a lot of processing to it or not, there's a familiarity that you want to bring. to the listener, so that it doesn't seem completely foreign, even though it is kind of supposed to be foreign. You know what I mean? So, but as far as finding it, you know, anything is up for grabs. I was just listening to like how they did the this power up sound in the new Batman, and the sound designer started with a bottle rocket, like just a pew, and stretched it way out, and that ended up being the power up sound that they used. And so, you know, anything's fair game.
Before any of you were born, I went to see Star Wars in a drive-in theater and took the screws off of the drive-in speaker. And me and my friend Steve, we connected a cassette recorder and recorded the whole movie, and then dissected it. I got to meet Ben Burt once, and I confessed to him about this, and he loved it because he did the same thing with Destination Moon 2 decades before. What you said, JR, using something in the real world and altering it, it then gives a familiarity to the audience on a subconscious level. That is, you know, that is work that works well. For me, I stumbled across all these electronics, and layering them together did things that sounded like things in the real world. On my albums, I have all these giant, you know, laser blasts and explosions and stuff, and those were done like 24 tracks of a mini Moog synthesizer and experimenting. But suffice to say, I think in anything we do, it's a lot of layers. I don't think it's ever just one sound. It's usually this combination of sounds, sometimes sounds that have never been combined before. So a weird ambient pad with a guitar string, you know, sometimes will create a new combination of things that has familiarity of both, but is uniquely new.
Something that I think I want to ask you all about, but I don't know, I'm not sure, is about cliches in sound. So I think on the average surface level, someone might, like an average person might say, oh yeah, there's this kind of like millennial clap or a marimba or whatever. Or in movies, I would say that the cliche that we probably hear the most is the Wilhelm scream.
Yes.
Are there any cliches or devices that you're tired of, you're over, you wish people would stop using? This is a good time to vent about it. For me, I'm sick of the marimba. Sorry. Oh, and pizzicato. No more pizzicatos, anything anymore. I know that's controversial.
Well, I'm working on a show where that's exactly what they're asking for, but I do agree and understand what you're saying. We tried on X Company, which was a show about Nazi Germany and our soldiers working against it. We actually created a German character named Wilhelm. We asked the showrunners to create a character, and then we wanted to have him die and use the Wilhelm scream. And unfortunately, the way the story developed, that never happened. We wanted to have Wilhelm actually fall down an elevator shaft or something.
Love it.
So
I
think older sounds are coming back.
Yeah.
Like older phone sounds, you know, vinyl scratching, for goodness sakes. Everybody's getting, you know, when vinyl first happened, I was sitting there scratching my head going, what are you talking about? It's noisy, it's crunchy. So I think old fashioned stuff is coming back. The steampunk era for sure. Lots of machines and mechanical things and gears can be used in rhythm tracks. And that works quite well.
Well, that's very kind, but what are you tired of?
I think my biggest sound effect that I'm tired of, this maybe not just like a cliche in terms of like a sound design approach, but there is a Doppler truck horn that I will, if I never hear it again, I will be a happy man. That's probably the biggest one that I notice all the time is ring. Yeah. It's just like, please, never again. But
I feel like that I hear a lot in commercial work. And then also there's that in a lot of movies, I hear that one child laugh. It goes like, it's like got a very specific cadence to it. I can hear it, like whenever I hear it in a movie, I'm like, oh, they're using a very specific library for that.
Yeah. Yeah. There's some wind as well that bugs me. I find there's like some whistly wind that you always hear. And I try always like, okay, is that one or not? And okay, don't use that.
I think for composers, it's presets. All of these synthesizers have preset sounds, and we start to recognize that among each other. And so for me, I always try and vary the presets, always change something up so that it's your own sound.
And Kristi, do you have any pet peeves?
Yeah, there's a few specific bird calls that I always notice, and they always bump for me. There's this one very specific blue jay that anytime I hear it, I just kind of cringe. So I've started just anytime I hear blue jays outside of my house, I just grab my recorder, run out and get them so I can use like fresh ones all the time wherever I can. Just to
And in
kind of-
Canada, I feel like we get a lot of loon calls, but they're a very specific loon that they've used.
yeah,
Yeah.
always the same
I,
one.
I think I put a loon in because they wanted it. We were like in the middle of a forest, and it was, and the body of water that's closest to them is like the ocean. And it's like this loon is never going to be here.
And they're always used for like
But they're
alien planet birds too.
Yeah, but they're creepy sounding, so you put them in there.
Mhm.
Oh my gosh. And Rachel, any pet peeves?
It's not really a pet peeve because I don't mind it, but there's this one iconic like a wild cat sound that gets used anytime there's like a big cat and they want that roar off screen. And it cracks me up every time I hear it because I'm like, there's got to be other recordings of big cats that can be used, but it's always this one that I always hear in like TV shows and films, and it's everywhere.
Wow, I can't even believe like we have like 5 minutes left till Q&A. I don't know how this has happened. I have so much more I want to ask you. I guess, so the one big thing I don't want to leave without asking, and we'll go with Amin first. What's it like collaborating with non-audio people? How do you communicate to them anything that needs to happen?
Easy. Talk about the emotion. There is this perception that everybody has, either people coming into the industry or people who worked there a long time, that you've got to really know the lingo, whether it's the type of sound design or even some of the technical things that Rachel was talking about. Go with the emotion. What is it you're looking for out of this scene? And I think if you explain that to your sound designer, you explain that to your dialogue editor, you explain that to the composer, then let us use our tools to help shape that. And then the other one is let us talk to each other. You know, there are certain systems sometimes set up where the sound designers and the composers don't get to know each other, or you don't work with the dialogue. The worst thing for us composers is we come up with this beautiful melody line and we didn't know there was an extra line of ADR coming on that big shot. You know, so that's where the French horn theme will be. And then what do you mean, these 2 extra lines of dialogue? So, you know, staying in touch with that so that you don't run into those kinds of railroads. It's just communicating, and yeah, use emotions. I don't think you need to use all the technical terms. Go with your instincts.
And JR, what's it like collaborating with creative keys who might not have any kind of training in music or sound design?
Yeah, I love it, to be honest with you. It used to bother me, like not being able to communicate in those sorts of ways, but I love listening to what people want to hear. Like I find this is maybe getting a little bit away from what you're asking, but when we get the project first turned over to us, the picture editors have put in their own temp sound effects. Sorry, my thing keeps falling out here. They put in their own temp sound effects, and I love listening to what they think is the most important sounds to be hearing at any point in the story. They might not be the greatest sounds, but I'm really just looking for the intention behind them. And you know, and so I enjoy that, and I enjoy sending my stuff out for a director to listen to, and then listening to what it is that they might have bumped on, or how they, how they felt about, X, Y, or Z, right? And the way they communicate it, it may not be the way that I want to hear it, or it may actually be very contradictory, to what they're talking about. But I think, if you're patient and you keep asking questions, you can kind of find out and interpret what it is and find out what they're looking for. So yeah, like I said, it used to bug me a bit, but it doesn't bother me at all anymore. And I think, to Amin's point as well, I think it's a really helpful, like talking about things that are a lot more common. We can all talk about emotions real easy and how it feels, or even, to Rachel's point earlier, talking about like references and things like that. Like, oh, okay, well, can you think of another spot in another movie that has this similar sound? Like YouTube is like fantastic for sound effects these days. I had one project where like the director would just constantly send me YouTube links, and I was like, oh, okay, great. This is super easy to talk about.
Spinning off of that, Kristi, would you rather work with somebody who has a really strong vision as a showrunner, or someone who's like, I give you full creative control and I really do mean it, I'm not lying?
Yeah, but both of those are kind of exciting. They present different challenges. It's nice to have someone who kind of has a strong vision of what they want and then try and work with that. But then someone who's not sure, it gives you a lot more freedom to try things out and pass things back and forth, get any kind of references they may be thinking about. But yeah, both can be really fun, for sure.
Rachel, how do you deal with ear fatigue? Because I feel like your work is, you've got to listen to the very finite details and still make things really exciting for what could be 200 hours of playable time. So how do you still get excited and feel fresh sonically about the project when you're working on it for months, if not years?
I think ear fatigue is inescapable for all designers at various points. Um, yeah, working on it's always the same because you have to listen, especially if you're working on quiet sounds, you have to bump up the gain and you got to like really listen to everything really carefully, and your ears are going to get tired. I think our biggest concern is like not tiring out the players though. And so we use a lot of like dynamic audio to achieve that. So we'll have a lot of ducking, live ducking based on like different inputs from the game to figure out what should be highlighted at any given moment. And we'll do a lot of things to like bring certain sounds down, groups of sounds, like maybe Foley is not as important during a boss battle, that'll go down, music will come up, but then all the impacts have to be louder or something. And then we always try to make space for quiet moments in our games too. Like if it's not wall-to-wall combat and there's not wall-to-wall music, where are the spots where we can do more with ambiences? So yeah, fatigue is definitely a concern, but I think I haven't found a way to like get rid of it completely. You're always going to have moments where you're working with loud sounds over and over again. And then especially if you're doing lots of variations for like an explosion and you need 10 different variations so they don't all sound like they're cookie cutter in a game, your ears are going to get tired for sure.
Okay, I think we have to pivot to the Q&A. I mean, I think it's 4:44 and we've got 2 questions, but then if we don't have any other questions, I still want to ask you a lot more. We've got a question for Kristi specifically. Do you do your own field recording? And is there time to do field recording? I'll stop there. There's more questions and not one question, but we'll go there.
Yeah, I try to get out and do as much as I can, depending on timelines, of course, but yeah, there's so many cool opportunities you just want to throw in as much as you can of your own material and get creative and bend and twist whatever you can find and put your own spin on things.
This other question is about children's animation, so I'll throw this one to JR. Are there any pre-made sound libraries that you recommend for someone who works in children's animation?
Oh, geez. Not really, to be honest with you.
Yeah, they all suck.
Well, I don't. Yeah, I don't know, to be honest with you. I haven't really like sought out a specific children's animation sound effects library. I'm not even sure what that would contain, to be honest with you. Yeah. Sorry, I don't really have a great. That's a terrible answer.
Anyone else have any other sound libraries that they might like to use, or is it really just like
I got libraries that I like to use. It was more the specific
of children's animation?
Yeah. Like we have a great library at Sound Dogs. It's the Sound Deluxe library. It's a massive library that was like a Hollywood library at Todd-AO and Sound Deluxe. They're old companies from Hollywood, and it's a fantastic library. It's like obviously way out of the reach of most people because it's a very expensive and massive library, but it's got a ton of great stuff. There's a lot of great libraries. Well, I'm sure most of these people would know, if they're sound people, they would know about A Sound Effect, which is a really great website for a lot of like independent and smaller, more like niche-y libraries. If you just need, I just need this one vehicle, or I just need like, to the person's question, if they're looking for, say, like little hops and bounces or something for kids animation, I'm sure you could find some specific libraries geared around those sorts of things on that site.
Actually, I've got a question to the sound designers, because decades ago when I was working in radio, I had to create all kinds of radio plays and sound design for that. And back then we used Sound Ideas and Hollywood Edge. And Sound Ideas was the bread and butter one, and Hollywood Edge had some really, really great things in it, but cost a little more. Either of those libraries have any value now? Does anybody use those anymore? Okay, I'm that old.
I don't. Yeah,
that's all I needed to know.
Those old libraries.
Throw out the CDs.
For sure, like those old general libraries are definitely, like, they've got a lot of those old sounds, like those sounds that we were just talking about, right? That we all kind of hate because they've been used a cajillion times.
Right.
But Sound Ideas as a company, they actually own that Sound Deluxe library now that I was talking about.
Right.
And,
Yeah, they do a lot of distribution, don't they? Yeah.
Yeah, they do, and they continue to go out and record new stuff as well. And so, they're certainly like one of the industry leaders as far as libraries. But I think that one thing that's been really great over the last, say, like 5 to 10 years is these new independent libraries that have sprung up and And websites like A Sound Effect are just like, that's all they do is just deal in these small, like I have a bunch of my own stuff up on that site. And but it's just great because you can just find these, oh, $20 for this, or $80 for that, or $100 for this, and you don't have to go and spend thousands and thousands of dollars on these massive libraries.
Yeah, I
Sorry to
probably
go
visit
back-
that site for every project I work in. I probably at least buy one thing from a sound effect. Just
Yeah, right. It's
so much
a
great
library.
niche content. Just this
Oh,
one
yeah.
specific car that I can't go out and record for this one episode. So I'm just gonna check it out over here.
Were you gonna say, Rachel?
Oh, sorry, just to go back to like the animation one. I use it for like wacky sound effects in games as a layer, but there's Boom has a tunes library that has a lot of like funky, iconic, like cartoon, like wee and like little wishes and stuff that might be good for layering some comedic stuff in.
For anyone who's on this panel, I will listen back to the recording, make a list of all the sound design and sound effects libraries we talk about. I'll make a thread on Twitter. So don't worry, I will keep track of everything. So if you haven't been following along, I'll keep track for you. We have another question, and it's about series animation timeline turnaround, but because we don't all do that work, I want to ask each of you what the average project turnaround time looks like for an average project for you. I'm going to start with Rachel, just because she was the last one to speak.
Games vary so widely, I would say on average, and it's really hard because it could be anywhere between a few weeks and a few years, maybe like a year for an average size like indie game.
That seems like a really long time, but actually I'm sure it goes quite fast at certain points.
It never feels like enough time.
Yeah. And Kristi?
For all the series stuff that I've done, typically it's 2 weeks per episode. So we'll get the lock and then we have about 2 full weeks to do any recording we want to do, have our spotting session if we have them. And then the playback is usually a day, mixes a day. And yeah, features can totally vary depending. It could be a couple weeks, a couple months, really depends on budgets and things like that.
Because we haven't heard as much from Kristi and Rachel, I'm dying to know from each of you how you know when a project is done. Because it could never be done, right? With music and sound and little things like that, it could go on forever. So at what point is it when you're just like internally like, I'm done with this? What tells you it's done?
Usually the schedule. Like I'm working on things until, the day before. You want to put as much into it. And the longer things go on, the more ideas you get, right? The first draft, you're always just trying to sketch out your ideas. And then by the time a couple weeks go by, a couple days go by, you might get another idea that's even better. You might have another idea from a director. You might get inspired by something out in nature and want to try a different avenue. So yeah, basically right up until the wire.
And Rachel, same thing?
Pretty much that. Very rarely do we get like a few weeks after all the design and hookups are done where we get to play a game and just mix and polish. Sometimes it happens, it's very rare. So I'd say like our cutoff date is usually a calendar date, like it's going for Gold Master, stuff is getting printed onto disc for physical release copies. And then that is our cutoff.
We just got a fresh question related to this, but it's about negotiating deadlines. And so I want to ask Amin and JR about that. How do you negotiate how long you need? Is it just by being quite firm?
I think again at the initial stages, you find out what the schedule is, and it's more about how you can accommodate the schedule. I think very rarely can you come back and say, I need 3 weeks for this, not 2 weeks.
Yeah.
One of the first projects I got handed, the post-production supervisor said, you've got 2 weeks per episode. I went, great. And then I looked at the schedule and he had them overlapping. So it was like, no, you can't work on 2 shows.
That's
on the
not how
same day.
time
Yeah,
works.
I know.
Oh my goodness.
So, yeah, I'll never forget that one. I think, like so many things, there are things where you rise to the occasion. Kristi talked about deadlines. Sometimes a deadline is a really good thing. You get into decision phobia, especially with all the new equipment we have now. And sometimes having that cutoff means, hey, this is as good as it's going to get. And usually a week later, when you listen to it and it doesn't suck, you're like, okay, I guess that was a good decision, because you can definitely overthink these things. And then every now and then on something very elaborate, you go to your showrunner, you go to your visionary, and you say, look, I get that you want to do this, but that's going to take an extra, amount of time. Is there another way we can accomplish the same thing? It's communication. Again, it's a very, very big part of it. And then on those odd projects where you're dealing with someone that is on a power trip, that is not anything to do with the production, that's only happened a couple of times in my career. That's why we have an agent. Composers have an agent. Sound designers, do you have agents sometimes? Well, Ben Bird, I guess, has an agent. Probably Randy Tom does.
I don't know.
Only a couple of times has that become necessary, but I think just talking.
I want to ask another question. It's kind of controversial. How do you work on a project you don't necessarily feel excited about? Like, how do you just get excited? I mean, we can't work on, not every project can be a passion project, right? So, Amin, how do you get yourself gassed up to work on something? I know it's hard, right? It's
Start
like,
with me all the time. I just like, yeah,
because
well,
you're at the top of my screen. It's too
Oh.
bad.
okay. Again, you look for challenges. Like, I wanted to work in a lot more science fiction. And you look back on my resume, I've got a couple of sci-fi things, but it's mostly Flashpoint and Anne with an E. I wanted to work on Star Trek. But Flashpoint turned out to be Star Trek. It's a group of people on a mission, and the emotional music needed for that was very similar to something for a sci-fi spaceship. So I just had to rethink how I was doing. And with an E needed a lot of Celtic music. I didn't think I was going to be able to do that. And actually, my co-writer Ari Posner was much better on that, so he handled that kind of stuff. And then they asked me to do classical music, which was very small, and I like my orchestral stuff to be very large. So suddenly, I was doing very, very delicate things with piano and cello. And I learned stuff about myself and learned about that writing style. So I think as long as there's a sense of quality to the project, even if it's not a genre that you know, the first one on your bucket list to go to, if there's some quality there, I think there's always learning and growth that you can bring your unique perspective into something that can help the project. And then sometimes you learn new things. I've had music revised several times by my director producer, and at first it's been very painful, and I've gone back later and done what they've said, and guess what, it is better. So it's a collaboration. You've got to be open to these happy things happening.
JR,
Sorry, what was it?
but how do you work on a project you're not
Oh, yeah, that you don't
super
like. Yeah,
jazzed
right,
about?
right.
What,
Yeah,
maybe
I think
not that you're like, you don't like it, but you're like, oh, this is
no, I know you just
a
yeah,
job.
you're not yeah, for sure. I think to what Amin was saying, for me, it's always looking for challenges. Maybe it's a new piece of software that you haven't really dug into too much, so you pull that out, and it's like, all right, you know what, I'm going to do it this way this time, or it's or even to like what Kristi was saying about recording stuff. Well, it's not that interesting a project, but I'm going to make it interesting because even though it's just like cars driving by and birds twittering, I'm going to go out and record some new cars and bring them back and do that kind of thing. And so you just try and make the most of it. And, to me, that's the biggest thing, is just looking for some challenges that can get you motivated.
We have 5 minutes left. Are there any other burning questions from the audience for any of our panelists? I would encourage everyone to check out all of our wonderful panelists' work and follow them on social media, and be sure to show some love. I guess we can wrap by just kind of maybe I'll ask Kristi, what are you excited about? What keeps you excited about your work day after day? Like what little things in your day make you excited?
I just love recording all the new sounds I can. Love working in sound in general. There's always so many new challenges. Every new episode of any show has some kind of new thing to design. There's just always something new. The variety is, whether it's live action, animation, different genres. Kids animation always has so many new challenges. It's so much less literal than live action. So there's always some kind of new crazy thing to design.
Thank you. And Rachel, what keeps you excited?
Well, I guess games in general they're really exciting. Game audio in particular is really exciting. Like right now we're working on, I think, at least 8 different active projects, and no 2 are the same. They're all different genres. The game mechanics are all different. The worlds are all different. And so that's every aesthetic for each game is always going to be different. And so just on their own, the projects themselves are varied and really exciting all the time. So I feel really lucky that I can say that.
In our last minute, JR, what are some things that you're excited about in terms of the future of future tools that we're going to be able to access for you to get your job done in a more exciting, more immersive way?
Yeah, well, you just hit the buzzword from like the last 5 or 6 years, right? Is immersive audio is a big thing. But you know what? technology wise, I think some of the new workflows that people are coming up with to work with sound is interesting to me. I'll be honest with you, I am not a bleeding edge technology guy. But I think, there's some companies that are using, like visual effects, sort of like software ideas in terms of, and I think Rachel mentioned this, like emitters, where they've got particle distribution and then they're attaching sounds to each of those particles so that they can move them around and create new sounds with. I think that's really interesting. I think like Waves just came out with a, artificial intelligence noise reduction plugin, using, just thinking about sound in different ways. I think we're so used to like, patching sounds here to there, or using the same kind of, phasers and flangers and reverb and whatever, like the same kind of plugins or effects processors that we've used for a long time. And so, yeah, like I said, I haven't embraced a lot of that stuff yet, but I do find it really interesting. And, it would probably be something that I'll eventually dip my toes into more and more to, okay, how can I use this? And how can I think about sound in a different way than I have for the last, 15, 20 years?
Amazing. We're out of time. Rhiannon should jump back on now.
Hello. Thank you so much. A huge thank you to Amin, JR, Kristi, Rachel, and Katie for today's conversation. And another thank you to our partners at Directors Guild of Canada in Ontario for presenting all of our sessions today. For more industry discussions, peer beyond the frame and discover the award-winning artisans behind your favorite films and TV shows on Wider Lens, a collection of interviews, podcasts, and deep dives brought to you by the Directors Guild of Canada in Ontario. Wider Lens captures real stories and candid conversations about the art of filmmaking and the partnerships forged behind the camera, across departments, and between creators. Sign up for the Wider Lens monthly newsletter at thewiderlens.ca.